I'm joined by James Graham, screenwriter, playwright, and, in fact, writer of the very excellent play Dear England, about the England football team, and in particular, the way in which Gareth Southgate has turned it all around for us. Thank you so much for joining me today, James. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. Cheers.
Could you start off with perhaps telling us a little bit about the play? I had the great pleasure of going to see it on Tuesday night, and I did some laughs, I did some cries. It was, the full gambit of emotion. So do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm not like an obsessive football fan, but I do really, as a playwright, as a dramatist, I do really enjoy taking these often sort of weird institutions that pepper our public life and trying to tell a story inside them that might reveal something about our identity or our situation and what it can say about us. And I think the England football team's presence in our national story has always been really, really prevalent and significant. And in particular, a few years ago, I just got completely obsessed by what Gareth Southgate was doing and how beyond performance and results and trophies, something way more interesting and existential was happening in terms of how he was transforming not just the performance of the team, but the culture, the feel, the vibes, the soul of a team. How it was feeling way more positive, progressive and transformative than it had for decades. And I was just curious how somebody goes about doing that. And as soon as I started digging into it and discovering that they really went deep on the mindset, psychology, emotional qualities to the team's identity. They did a lot of politics, they did a lot of history, they did workshops on the history of English identity, and they tackled racism and masculinity. All the things that I just found so surprising that would be present in a modern sports environment, especially one that has associations, arguably, with a certain kind of toxic masculinity that the England football team does, that they were so up for it, for being vulnerable or testing a new way of working, and it just seemed to work.
So I love football. I support Charlton Athletic. So, I mean, you have to have some love to follow a team like Charlton. But I think that football is so interesting in so many ways, what it says about our society, our culture, etc., etc., but also what it sort of says about the male psyche in particular.
Yeah.
And the way that these kind of different and quite often pretty awful facets of masculinity kind of reveal themselves. Do you think that's a sort of fair thing to say, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated, isn't it? Because as with everything, there's good and bad. I mean, there are some really beautiful and wonderful elements to that culture, and that. I mean, it's basically the only window of time every week where it's okay in a traditional structure for a bloke to go and cry and be really upset about something and get really upset, and for May to go, I'm really sad about it, because it's centered around something, I guess, competitive. It gives you permission to be passionate, to get excited, to lower your guard, and I think that's all for the good. But there's no pretending that there's also some incredibly dark elements to that, and that's been shown for decades. The uniquely English problem that international football had in the late 90s and early 90s, always being us who went to foreign towns and smashed them up. And like, what's that about, guys? I mean, why weren't the Italians doing that? Why weren't the Spanish doing that? What was that about the English identity that meant we unleashed this anger, or something buried in us just got activated in sport? Similarly, I hope the play starts to question, like, what is strength? What is it doubling down and stiff up a lip, crack on, or is there strength in being vulnerable? Is there strength in accepting your fears and sharing those fears with your teammates, which is the new culture that Gareth and his team have tried to coax out of the squad. It's certainly the case that the golden generation of football play we had 10 years ago, as we talk about in the play, people like Lampard and Beckham and Gerrard, the best players we've ever had in a way, and yet we were having the worst performances because they just couldn't be a team. They couldn't bond. They couldn't play together. They couldn't play as a unit, because to do that you have to be vulnerable. You have to give yourself and accept accept your flaws. And that's why I think is so exciting and brilliant about the emotional intelligence of these players like Saka and Kane. And I find it really inspiring.
One of the big themes of the play is failure, or the fear of failure. And I guess kind of like other aspects of it, like, male fragility, English fragility. I wonder what you thought about that kind of fear of failure. Do you think that is a particularly male trait?
Oh, I don't know. You tell me. I think it is. How primal it is, I don't know, or how cultural it is instead. But something about territory and about winning and about being the top dog. And I think that does couple unhelpfully with a sense of Englishness that is about, I guess, all of these are generalizations, of course, but a sense of resentment about not quite being where we think we should be or used to be, and mourning and grieving and feeling a sense of bitterness about where we were rather than where we are or where we could be. And I think if you smash those two things together, the worst aspects of masculinity with the worst aspects of English exceptionalism, it could be a pretty toxic mix, and has proven to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely. I don't think it's inherent. I think it is definitely more a cultural or societal, like it's sort of the way we're conditioned. I guess I think it's more acceptable for women to fail at certain things, and I guess potentially not in other ways. I guess I don't know.
That feels true. I can't. Yeah, it does feel true. And an example of this is so this new philosophy of exactly as you described. It sounds counterintuitive to some probably pretty hardcore sports fans who and I accept that there's no shame in competitive sports and wanting to win, and that being ultimately the end result. When I went and spent time with Gareth Southgate, I was celebrating all of his soft, nice stuff about culture and environment and creating a nicer place to work and be. But he was still very clear that the absolute end result was to win, and unless he brought home some silverware, then he'll feel like he's failed. But yes, this new idea came in, and actually in the form of a lot of different psychologists, sports psychologists, including a really inspiring figure called Dr. Pippa Grange, who wrote a book about fear, and fear in sport, or fear more universally in any environment, in relationships or in the workplace, and how our denial of that, our rejection of fear and pretending it doesn't exist, or not analysing it because of the shame that comes with that, and possibly again some like English stiff upper lip, that you'll never learn to lose well. And one of her arguments is that, and we express it in the play, it's not England doesn't need to learn how to win, it needs to learn how to lose, and we are terrible at losing. And some people are really brilliant at losing. So famously, the Germans, they lost to us in the year 2000. I think, that famous 5-1 defeat. And so traumatizing to the Germans to lose to us to that degree, they went on a decades-long reset, Das Reboot. They just decided to try and use that moment to create a great level of introspection and come up with solutions. And they completely transformed their game, both culturally, but also into funding and training and development. And then they come back 15 years later and they win the World Cup again. We have never been able to do that. When we fail, we stew and we boil in it, and we're angry and resentful, and then we just repeat the same mistake again and again and again, which is why we're locked in this really repetitive trauma about 1966, but the fact that we just, one World Cup and 2 World Wars, we just can't get over it for some reason. And until we learn to lose better, and I think we're getting there. I think the story of Gareth's story is we are learning to lose better and trying to take lessons from it. But it's a hard thing to sell, isn't it? Because it sounds so counterintuitive in the world of elite competitive sport.
That was one of the we don't need to learn to win, we need to learn how to lose, was one of the bits that made me feel a bit emotional. I'm not going to lie to you. Pippa Grange is a very interesting character in all this, because it sort of strikes me that a woman has to come in to sort it all out, basically. We have to enlist a woman to come in and teach us how to have emotions and how to deal with them and how to feel. And she always kind of like reminds me of this sort of like Wendy kind of character. I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, it's a dangerous night, isn't it? Because it feels like quite maybe a familiar story where a woman comes in and knocks the boys' heads together and say, "Oh, for God's sake, just feel things and you'll be fine." And I think it's actually much more interesting than that. That Pippa Grange is a massive sports fan, and she desperately wants her teams to win. She just wants them to win deep and not them win shallow. And shallow victories aren't good for anyone. And I get very moved when I speak to her about this particular element of her work, and she writes about this really well, and we express it slightly through her character in the play. Her greatest anger and frustration about particularly male fear is what it robs them of. It's not what it prevents you from doing. It stops you from having joy. And what a great tragedy of life if you can't have joy in your either in playing your game or in your relationships with your partner or your family, because you're just scared all the time. You're scared of humiliating yourself. You're scared of being shamed. So nothing brings you joy. So you stop doing things. You either in a less significant way, you don't make that long pass up the field because you think if you get it wrong, the fans will boo you, or you don't tell the girl or the boy how you feel because all of your validity comes with being strong and not with being weak. And I really associate with that and what Vicky has played in my life a bit. You know, none of that's rocket science, but to really, really call that out in a dressing room and go, you're all afraid, aren't you? And it's okay. And so what we're going to do about that. And what I find really inspiring from a women's point of view as well is this philosophy came in, this new philosophy to the entirety of the England teams, and that includes the under-21 and the women's team. And the women just nail it. So the men are getting there, but that idea of playing without fear and playing with joy, and that being okay to go, it would be really good if we'd all have fun while we play football as well as all the other stuff. The women have just demonstrated that to the absolute best capacity, but you can see the performance on the pitch. They're playing with absolute fearlessness and just really enjoying it, and it's inspiring. And I think the men are some way behind on that, and arguably that is why the women are the only people to have brought home a trophy since 1966.
When I have these conversations with people with men, usually, I must say, about how the skill is different or the game is different, or it's not the same to watch the women's team as it is to watch the men's team. I think there is a quality to the women's game that is so much more entertaining to watch than the men's game. And I think that it is that fearlessness, it is that real passion. And I think it is very reductive to bring it all down to, oh, they're rich and they're paid too much and blah, blah, blah. But I think for a long time in the women's game, you had to really, really want to be there because there wasn't that much in it for you.
Yeah, can you imagine that? Yeah, the stadiums are empty, you're not getting coverage. This a certain level of sneering and stereotypes about the kind of women who play sports at that level. And yeah, no, completely, totally. But I think we expressed this in the play that the men deal with the high expectations, and that's terrible, but men deal with low expectations. It's just terrible. And for whatever reason, I feel like the women's team in the past 3 years have completely liberated themselves from that. It's a very inspiring thing to watch.
So you actually got to spend time with the man himself, Gareth Southgate. And what was that like?
It was brilliant. I'm walking up to the training ground at St George's, all my imposter syndrome kicked in a little bit, and I remember what it was like to put a PE kit on as an 11-year-old boy at school and feel completely inadequate and like I was going to get fouled out. But it's a great play, and he is just, as you would entirely expect, incredibly decent, humble and generous. He's generous in the sense that actually he's not hugely comfortable with there being a famous actor playing him on stage, and because he himself is also a storyteller, how he controls the narrative, not in a dominant way, but how those players, and they use this language, how they're trying to write new stories and be in charge of their own narrative. Here's a playwright in London sort of writing their story even before it's ended to an extent. So I think he just thinks, gosh, that's quite a lot. But because he's so nice and decent, he still couldn't say no to me and say, can I come and spend time with you? So he gave me a day and introduced me to his team, and I got under the bonnet a bit of how you run an English and an England football team and the philosophy that's guiding it. It was a real privilege.
I've said this on the podcast a lot, so it would be very familiar territory to our listeners, but I kind of want Gareth Southgate to adopt me. That's sort of how I feel about him. And I think that the redemption arc of Gareth Southgate is one of the greatest love stories of the 21st century. Like, I genuinely think it's just, in 2018, and you capture it so brilliantly in the play, the whole, Gareth Southgate, why have we got him? Like, what was this, loser, basically. Why is this loser coming in? Well, what people, I guess, who maybe don't follow football so much wouldn't necessarily have known, the incredible impact he was having on the youth team at the time when he was brought in. I think they won. Did they win the under-17s World Cup? Obviously, they've all now come into his senior squad, and that's been a great thing about it. But yeah, I just think the redemption arc of Gareth Southgate is just the most heartwarming and wonderful tale. And I kind of think that what he's done for the England team in a lot of ways, certainly at that time, and I'll come on to the present day in a minute because I do have some things to say about that, but at that time, during that World Cup, I think that kind of translated, that kind of followed through into the rest of the country. What do you think about that?
Without question, that's why I started to want to write it. But I'm glad you think that about his arc, because, I mean, in a way, from a dramatist point of view, it's almost too perfect. If I hadn't made that up, it would be really cheesy. The guy who very painfully went through that experience in 1996 of missing a penalty when we were hosting the Euros, and denying us the chance to get to the first final since the 66, and him spending 20 years with that trauma and coming back and using it to help a younger team of players deal with the pressure of taking a penalty kick and breaking the penalty curse. England had never won a penalty shootout in a World Cup ever, and it was Gareth Southgate who did it. It's beautiful, and I love it, for all those reasons. But so in Russia 2018, when that moment happened, and it happened for him personally, stood there in his waistcoat, having that personal redemption, but that redemption for the entire nation as well. I was incredibly moved by it, but I think what you're saying is entirely correct. Something else was going on that is harder to define. It's a mood, it's a feeling, but everyone just started to feel really, really good about these lads and about what they represented in terms of values, how you carry yourself, your conduct on the pitch, how you handle each other. Even people who don't care about football, like my mum doesn't really follow it, but when I spoke to her about it, she just kept saying, I just seem to really like these guys. I don't know why. I just think these are really good guys. And 4 or 5 years ago, we were booing them off the pitch, and we thought they were bad role models, the excess, or because of we assumed they didn't care, and they were just, like you say, rich and famous and weren't putting the time into international games like they did their clubs. And I never thought that was true, but obviously the unspoken thing here is what else is going on in the country at the time, which is the most chaotic, difficult, divisive period in modern British and English history. And against that backdrop of things feeling like they're falling apart, or a real existential crisis in terms of our national identity and feeling good about our national identity, here's this guy just being really decent and good and cracking on and trying to make his team not just perform well, but behave well. And I think that bled out, like you say. I knew something was happening as early as that tournament, 3 tournaments ago.
So to pick, I guess, an obvious example, Raheem Sterling, for example, who I think, you forget I think he was a teenager in 2010 at that World Cup when we left horribly early. He was basically a child, and the amount of abuse that he got, obviously with a horrible racist undercurrent in the press. And I think I always felt he looked scared in that shirt. He looked frightened. He didn't know what to do. The ball would come to him when in the Euros in 2016. Sorry, the World Cup wasn't 2010. When was it? It must have been 2012.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, in the Euros in 2016, which obviously was a disaster, he looked frightened when the ball came to him. He looked like something was holding him back. And I think to see the way that Gareth Southgate has made those boys want to play for him and succeed for him, and the joy that it brings them, is an incredible thing to see. And I think a lot of that is to do with expectation as well, like the weight of expectation. But I think also this national identity thing that you're talking about is really interesting. This kind of I think we're very confused about who we are. This once great nation or whatever, and we like to believe that we are still this great nation and people care about us, and in reality we're a bit of a laughing stock. Do you think that's sort of cuts quite deeply to the English psyche.
I'm obsessed by this question. I'm not a therapist, and I don't think I can diagnose the English psyche specifically, but I do think it feels true that, look, you're never going to have a healthy, happy existence if you're in denial about who you are and the reality of your circumstances. And it's okay for your circumstances to change, to improve, or to get worse, as long as you are able to find meaning and strength in that moment. And that can be as an individual or as a country. And there's something about the English condition, which if we just found peace with our new inheritance and where we are in the world, and began to, as Gareth Southgate uses this phrase, begin to write new stories for the real England that we are, rather than harking back to narratives and stories that we inherit about the past and being a great power and empire and things. It's not talking your country down to just accept the reality of where you are and then find excitement and joy and strength about that. But because we don't quite do that, and because we have this level of resentment that maybe that gets passed down, I think that leads to poor decisions. And I'm not making any comment about recent decisions, including that famous one in 2016, which ties in neatly with the start of this story. But arguably, whether the plus or the negatives of deciding to make that choice in that referendum, and there are good reasons and bad reasons, a decision based on bitterness and anger and resentment, I think that's where it ties in thematically to what's happening on the pitch. If you are playing with anger, if you're playing with frustration, that you can't handle the expectation because you're not living in some kind of truth, then you're not going to perform well. And I don't feel like we are performing well as a nation because we are not accepting the truth of our situation anymore. And so we're never going to reset, never going to reinvent, never going to reform because we're still living in the past.
Now, I don't want to get into the negativity of recent events, but I am going to. So I didn't watch the last World Cup, despite being a very big football fan. I boycotted it. I decided I didn't want to have anything to do with it. And obviously, we could debate all day, I'm sure, the rights and wrongs of that and, the double standards and, will we be making a fuss when we go to America and women's rights are being, really fucked about with women over there, for want of better words? Will we be talking about, the human rights in that situation? Probably not, no. But I kind of felt like the whole vibe of it, this sort of brilliant Southgate era, I felt like it was sort of sullied a little bit. And when I think about it, they're in an impossible situation, really, aren't they? Because they can't be everything to everyone. But it did feel so disappointing to me, the stance that was taken over the armbands of the LGBTQ plus rights, etc., etc. It sort of took the shine off it a bit for me. Do you think there is a danger that our expectations of the England team and Gareth Southgate are sort of really high in a different way now?
I think that's totally fair. And I felt many personal things during that time. And even though I tried to keep sort of an empathetic, nuanced hat on and going, gosh, well, what an impossible standard I'm setting myself. And you're allowed to feel all those things. And I still don't know what the right thing to do was. But in a way, I guess he's a victim of the standards he set for himself by being so impossibly good and decent. And then with something incredibly complicated comes along and the standards you set for yourself come back on yourself. But I don't blame you at all, I know. And look, it's the culture war, isn't it, as well? I'm not saying that was you driving you, but, my local MP in Ashfield, Lee Anderson, he boycotted the Euros because, for the polar opposite reason, because they were taking a stance, because the players were taking a knee during the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, and wanting to show solidarity with their black players, which seems to me perfectly reasonable and beautiful stance to take as a team. He took exception to it, so he boycotted that. And then on the progressive left, they boycotted Qatar. And it is impossible to be a team for all people. But I mean, maybe to resemble us, these players have never just been players. As soon as kids, little boys and little girls, put your poster up on a bedroom wall or wear your name on your back, you're going to be a role model. You're going to represent something more than just a sport. And that is another burden they carry, and some carry it really impressively as well. Like it mentioned, Marcus Rashford, Raheem Sterling, these are people who accept that responsibility and that burden, and in my humble opinion, really nail it in finding expression for particular causes. I don't think that's going away. I don't think politics is leaving the sport anytime soon. We're gonna find ourselves continually with contradictory feelings about what's happening and what we think the best response from the England football team is meant to be.
So I wanted to ask you, because you've written some like incredible plays on TV over the last few years. I saw Labour of Love when that was showing, which was fantastic. The Uncivil War, Quiz, Sherwood was just about one of the, I don't want to blow smoke up your ass, James, but I'm going to, just about one of the best things I've seen on TV in forever. I think one of the things that you do so beautifully is that you really, really tap into the mood of a nation at a specific point in time and what is going on around it. Like, I think you did that even in Quiz, which was, you know, like absolutely brilliantly. Is that something that you sort of always try to do with your work? Is that one of the themes that you always want to bring out, is what is going on in the country and how the mood is?
Yeah, I mean, very consciously, actually, and I'm sure I sometimes get close to that and sometimes fail in that, but that is the aspiration, because I just think that's the joy of finding these stories, especially these idiosyncratic or eccentric pockets of our national life or our history, and using them as some sort of vessel to make sense of. I almost think of them as anxieties, whatever the current anxiety nation is, or myself at that time. So you mentioned Quiz, which is actually just a bit of a silly story about a coughing major who did or did not cheat his way to $1 million on a game show. But into that, I saw an opportunity to, I guess, talk about what at that time was my chief anxiety, which was about truth and what can be known anymore. And here's the story using the format of questions and answers and facts, and I guess also to an extent to do with mob justice and all that stuff. So you can always find these ways in, and thank you. I'm really glad you like Sherwood, because that meant a lot to me, that one. That was set in my hometown, a former mining village, and I guess into that, I guess, you know, that was a police procedure about a manhunt, but I was allowed to have space, I think, to try and explore similar stuff to Dear England, really. You know, it baffles me that I just did it just then talking to you, but that I still refer to myself as coming from a former mining town. And I think there's a little speech that Leslie Manville gave at the end of that series about if even the language you use is about what you aren't anymore, and that's what kids grow up to describe themselves as being, something that they no longer aren't. I'm sure that seeps down to your subconscious and limits your capacity to imagine a different way. And I guess, the divisiveness of the miners' strike being used to look at the new tensions, social fabric frame, is it, that we have now. It's a privilege. I just feel dead lucky I get given these chances to take stories and use them as therapy for myself, or some other people as well, if they want to go on it right.
I just want to ask you very quickly, because you said you've been in Nottingham, and I know that there's a second series of Sherwood was commissioned. I was very intrigued thinking about what you would do with it. Can you say anything about it at all, or is it completely off limits at the moment?
I don't know. I mean, I won't hashtag spoiler, but yeah, it's almost a brand new story. So some of the characters come back. We have David Morrissey returning and Leslie Manville returning.
Thank God, because I love Leslie Manville so much.
How can you not? The Sparrow crime family come back, and for me it was about liberating myself from a bit like Gareth Southgate's team, liberating myself from expectations of what you should do in a second series, and actually just going, well, what's the next story I want to tell? He uses a real life tragedy, a real life crime, and that somehow exists in dialogue with the past and the legacy of industry and these Red War towns that we're seemingly obsessed with at the moment. So it's a new crime, a real life crime to do with gun violence in Nottingham in the early noughties, and how that once again threatens to open up old wounds within a community that's already pretty tense.
Well, I'm very, very excited to watch it when it's on. Where can we follow you on social media if we want to keep up to date with the many things that you are writing coming up?
I am on Twitter, Mr. James Graham, and likewise, same handle, I think, on Instagram, yet to join TikTok.
James, thank you so much for joining me.
It's been lovely to talk.